Let's be absolutely clear about what just happened, because if you blink, you might miss the staggering irony buried inside one of the most cynical trade maneuvers in recent North American history. The United States government, operating under a constitution that still legally permits slavery as a criminal punishment, has formally launched a forced labor investigation targeting Canada, not China, not an authoritarian regime with documented state-run labor camps. Canada, the country with socialized health care, stronger unions than America has seen in 4 decades, and provincial minimum wages that embarrass roughly a third of American states. Let that settle for a moment, because the audacity of it genuinely deserves a few seconds of silence before we tear it apart. The Commerce Department made the announcement with all the procedural seriousness of a body that believes its own premise. They are examining Canadian aluminum, softwood lumber, and agricultural imports under Section 307 of the Tariff Act, citing potential links to forced labor practices. Their specific target, the detail that should make anyone who has spent 5 minutes studying North American labor law spit out their coffee, is Canada's temporary foreign worker programs. Programs that operate with transparent federal oversight. Programs with documented protections. Programs that, by virtually every measurable international standard, function at a level of accountability that American agricultural labor operations have never come close to achieving. And yet, here is Washington pointing fingers northward with a straight face. This did not materialize from nowhere. The architecture of this moment was constructed deliberately, brick by brick, over the preceding weeks. 3 weeks before the formal announcement, the president stood at a rally in Michigan and started floating the idea that Canada was stealing American jobs through cheap labor. Not China, not any of the nations that appear routinely on actual forced labor watch lists maintained by international human rights bodies. Canada, a country where organized labor still holds genuine institutional power, where collective bargaining has not been systematically dismantled through right-to-work legislation the way it has across large swaths of the American South and Midwest. The crowd responded the way rally crowds respond to simple villains dressed in familiar clothing, and the narrative was born. 2 weeks before the announcement, the Commerce Secretary appeared on cable news and began field testing the phrase integrity checks in connection with North American supply chains. He said it with the practiced casualness of someone introducing language that has already been stress tested in focus groups. Integrity checks for Canada, the same Canada whose labor union density would be considered remarkable by the standards of almost any American state. 1 week before the announcement, a memo from the Trade Representative's Office was partially leaked, and what it revealed stripped away any remaining pretense about motivation. The document, according to sources familiar with its contents, described the forced labor angle as having political resonance. Not evidentiary merit, not factual foundation, political resonance. This was strategy dressed as policy, and the costume was never particularly convincing to anyone paying close attention. So the investigation was launched, and within hours, Ottawa responded with the kind of force that official diplomatic language rarely permits itself. The Prime Minister's office did not issue a carefully hedged statement designed to leave room for backroom negotiation. It went directly at the accusation, calling it precisely what the leaked memo had already confirmed it to be: protectionist trade policy wrapped in the language of human rights. The statement accused Washington of deploying performative morality, of weaponizing the vocabulary of worker dignity to achieve outcomes that have nothing to do with worker dignity and everything to do with choking Canadian industrial competitiveness ahead of the upcoming trade agreement review. And the accusation landed because it was demonstrably accurate. The Prime Minister then went further. He walked into Parliament, stood at the dispatch box, and delivered an address that political observers in Ottawa are describing as the most confrontational, direct challenge toward Washington from a Canadian head of government in at least 30 years. He told the chamber, reading from the official transcript, that Canada would not accept lectures on labor rights from a country that permits incarcerated people to work for fractions of $1 per hour and frames that arrangement as rehabilitation. He said Canada would not accept trade barriers dressed in the language of human rights from an administration that has spent years systematically weakening the protections available to its own workers. The chamber did not respond with polite parliamentary applause. It erupted. Opposition parties in a minority government situation where unified displays of support are genuinely rare rose and gave a standing ovation. because what Canadians across the political spectrum recognized in that moment was not partisan theater. It was someone finally saying plainly what everyone already understood. This is bullying, and Canada is done pretending otherwise. The countermeasures announced alongside that parliamentary address were not symbolic gestures. They were calculated, legally grounded, and specifically designed to turn the entire premise of the American investigation back on itself. Canada announced it would launch its own formal examination of American agricultural imports, with particular focus on whether products touching United States prison labor, which meets the definition of forced labor under every credible international framework currently in existence, have been entering Canadian markets. This was not rhetorical flourish. The legal foundation for that move is more solid than anything Washington has presented to justify its own probe. Because unlike the vague insinuations floating out of the Commerce Department, Canada can point to an actual constitutional amendment, to documented federal policy, to verified wage data showing incarcerated workers producing commercial goods for cents per hour. The evidentiary asymmetry between the two investigations is not subtle. Canada also announced it would be filing a formal dispute under the trade agreement's Chapter 31 mechanisms within days. That process, once triggered, can lead to legally protected retaliatory tariff measures. The potential targets identified include American steel, American vehicle exports, and American dairy products attempting to enter Canadian markets. Every one of those countermeasures would carry the legal cover of a rules-based dispute response rather than unilateral aggression, which is precisely the distinction that matters when you are trying to build international support for your position. Canada is not just fighting back. It is fighting back in a way specifically engineered to survive legal scrutiny and accumulate allied backing simultaneously. Trade lawyers following the dispute closely are pointing out something that should be deeply uncomfortable for the administration that launched this probe. The existing trade agreement between the three North American partners contains explicit language requiring parties to presume compliance with labor standards in the absence of credible contrary evidence. The United States has not presented credible contrary evidence. It has presented political rhetoric and manufactured concern, which are not the same thing and do not satisfy the evidentiary threshold the agreement requires. Canada's legal team is reportedly preparing arguments that the investigation itself constitutes a disguised restriction on trade, a category of action explicitly prohibited under the agreement's second chapter. If a neutral dispute panel accepts that argument and legal experts assessing the available grounds suggest Canada has a genuinely strong case, the consequences for the administration would extend well beyond embarrassment. It would open the door to significant retaliatory measures that carry full international legal legitimacy. Meanwhile, the human cost of this political theater is already materializing in communities that had nothing to do with the decisions being made in Washington. Approximately 30,000 workers are directly employed in Canadian primary aluminum production. These are not precarious, exploited laborers. These are unionized workers earning $60,000 to $70,000 annually with full benefits doing skilled industrial work in facilities that operate under regulatory oversight frameworks that American aluminum producers have never been required to meet. These workers woke up to the news that their industry had been designated a subject of forced labor concern by the government of their largest trading partner. The psychological weight of that accusation, leveled against people who have spent careers in well-compensated union employment, is not nothing, and the economic consequences followed immediately. Two major Canadian aluminum producers have already reported that American buyers are delaying purchase orders pending the outcome of the investigation. That is not a projected future harm. That is millions of dollars in revenue already evaporating because Washington decided the forced labor accusation had political resonance. The softwood lumber dimension carries its own particular bitterness because this is not the first time, not the second time, not even arguably the third time that Canadian forestry workers have watched American protectionism arrive wearing a new costume. British Columbia's forestry communities have been living with the cyclical reality of American trade aggression for decades. Every period of economic anxiety south of the border eventually produces a moment where Canadian lumber becomes the designated problem, regardless of the fact that American domestic lumber production is structurally incapable of meeting American domestic demand, and regardless of the fact that Canadian lumber is functionally keeping American residential construction costs from becoming completely unaffordable for the middle-class buyers the administration claims to champion. Towns like Prince George and Williams Lake, where forestry employment represents the majority of the local economic base, are watching this unfold with the exhausted recognition of people who have seen this particular play performed before. The difference this time is that forced labor accusations have been layered on top of the existing tariff disputes, adding reputational damage to economic disruption in a combination that is genuinely new and genuinely ugly. What makes the entire operation especially corrosive is that the people running it know exactly what they are doing. They know Canadian labor standards exceed American ones by most objective measures. They know the temporary foreign worker programs being cited have more regulatory oversight than equivalent American programs. They know the accusations are baseless. The calculation is not that the accusations will be proven. The calculation is that the accusations do not need to be proven to cause the intended damage. By the time Canada assembles the evidence to demonstrate what everyone already knows, which is that there is no forced labor problem in Canadian aluminum smelters or British Columbia logging operations, the orders will already have been canceled, the supply chains will already have been disrupted, and American competitors will already have captured market share that Canadian producers will struggle to recover. The accusation is the weapon. The investigation is just the delivery mechanism. This playbook has been used before, and the people deploying it are not improvising. In the first term, the same administration designated Canadian aluminum and steel as national security threats under Section 232 Tariff Authority, national security threats. From Canada, the country that has committed troops to virtually every significant military engagement the United States has undertaken over the past century. The country whose intelligence services share information with American counterparts so seamlessly that the distinction between the two operations is sometimes functionally invisible. The security threat framing was transparently absurd then, and it achieved its intended purpose anyway, because absurdity is not a disqualifier when the goal is disruption rather than legitimacy. The forced labor framing follows identical logic. It does not need to be true. It needs to create enough uncertainty to move economic behavior, and it is already accomplishing exactly that. The domestic American business community, which is not generally known for opposing Republican trade policy, is openly alarmed. The Chamber of Commerce, an organization whose political alignment has historically leaned so consistently toward the Republican Party that its opposition to an administration action genuinely registers as significant news, issued a statement warning that this investigation is a damaging idea. Their objection is not philosophical, it is arithmetic. Canada is the single largest export destination for 36 individual American states, not one of the largest. The largest. Any meaningful retaliation from Ottawa does not affect abstract trade statistics. It eliminates real jobs in real places that the administration has specifically identified as its political base. The auto industry is running its own calculations, and the numbers are not reassuring. Contemporary vehicle manufacturing across the North American corridor is so deeply integrated that a single finished automobile may incorporate components that cross the border between the two countries 6 or 7 times during the production process. You cannot introduce friction into that system without raising costs throughout it. And raising costs throughout it means American assembly plants face pressure that translates directly into workforce reductions. Agricultural trade associations are sounding alarms for similar reasons. Canadian buyers purchased approximately $25 billion worth of American agricultural products in the most recent annual period. That is not a peripheral market for Midwestern farm operations already navigating thin margins and structural economic fragility. It is a foundational revenue stream, and the prospect of Canadian retaliatory measures targeting that trade is not an abstraction to a soybean farmer in Iowa or a pork producer in Minnesota. It is an existential threat dressed in the clothing of someone else's political calculation. The economic team inside the administration is reportedly aware of these projections. They are apparently presenting modeling that shows the inflationary and growth consequences of a genuine trade war with Canada in terms that should concentrate attention. The political team is apparently winning the internal argument anyway, on the grounds that the base responds well to this kind of posture regardless of the downstream consequences, and that Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are more immediately relevant to political calculations than the long-term health of integrated North American supply chains. What distinguishes this particular moment from previous episodes of American trade aggression toward Canada is the character of the response it has generated. Earlier Canadian governments, operating under a different read of how to manage the relationship with a much larger and more powerful neighbor, tended toward diplomatic restraint when confrontations arose. Private channels were prioritized. Public statements were carefully calibrated to leave room for de-escalation. The underlying assumption was that the relationship was too important and too asymmetric to risk an open confrontation, and that quiet persistence would eventually produce better outcomes than public defiance. That approach is not what is happening now. The current Prime Minister is meeting aggression with moral clarity rather than diplomatic hedging, and the political consequences inside Canada have been immediate and dramatic. Approval ratings have moved 11 points upward in a single week. In the context of modern democratic politics, where single-digit movements over months are considered significant, 11 points in 7 days represents something closer to a realignment of public sentiment than a normal fluctuation. The international dimension of Canada's response strategy is equally deliberate. The Prime Minister has been working the phones with European counterparts, with Pacific trade partners, with Mexican leadership, building a coalition around a specific argument that transcends the bilateral dispute. The argument is this: if the United States is willing to launch a baseless forced labor investigation against Canada, a country that is democratic, developed, governed by rule of law, and allied with Washington across every significant security and intelligence framework in existence, then no country anywhere can consider itself insulated from politically motivated American trade aggression. That framing is resonating precisely because it is accurate, and the responses from allied governments reflect that. The European Union has issued supportive language. Japan's trade ministry has made public comments emphasizing the importance of evidence-based trade policy. These are not empty diplomatic gestures. They represent the early construction of an international consensus that isolates the United States on this specific question and gives Canada significantly more leverage than a simple bilateral dispute would generate. The trade agreement that the current administration once celebrated as its signature economic achievement, describing it as the greatest trade deal ever negotiated, contains specific provisions designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action. It established labor standards. It created enforcement mechanisms. It built dispute resolution architecture intended to ensure that disagreements were adjudicated through structured processes rather than unilateral announcements on cable television. By launching this probe entirely outside that framework, Washington is communicating something much larger than a position on Canadian aluminum. It is communicating that agreements mean whatever the current administration decides they mean at any given moment, and that the structures built to provide certainty and predictability in North American commerce are conditional on American political convenience. The damage that message does to the foundation of any future negotiation is difficult to overstate. Why would any government commit to good faith engagement on a trade agreement review with a partner that has just demonstrated open willingness to ignore the existing agreement whenever the political calendar makes that convenient? The workers on both sides of this border deserve better than to be used as props in a performance that will not improve a single material condition of their lives. American workers are not receiving raises because their government has launched this investigation. Their unions are not gaining new organizing rights. Their healthcare costs are not declining. Their children's educational opportunities are not expanding. None of the concrete, measurable improvements that would constitute genuine pro-worker policy are being delivered or even seriously proposed. What is being delivered is the feeling of a fight, the appearance of someone in Washington standing up against foreign competition, the emotional satisfaction of watching a powerful government point at something across the border and declare it a threat. That feeling is real. The policy substance behind it is non-existent. Real pro-worker governance looks like strengthening collective bargaining protections, raising wage floors, expanding access to healthcare and affordable education, investing in the retraining infrastructure that displaced workers actually need. None of that is on the table. Instead, there is an investigation into Canada, and the tragedy is that some portion of the people this rhetoric is designed to reach will believe it represents something meaningful being done on their behalf. Canadian workers, meanwhile, are watching their government do something genuinely different. The Prime Minister is not defending abstract trade principles or diplomatic protocol. He is defending the dignity of aluminum workers in Quebec and forestry workers in British Columbia, who have been smeared with accusations that bear no relationship to the reality of their working lives. He is defending communities whose entire economic existence is bound up in industries that Washington has decided are useful political targets. The surge in his public support is not manufactured. It reflects something real about what people respond to when they feel genuinely represented rather than strategically deployed. There is a difference between a leader who uses workers as rhetorical ammunition and a leader who actually stands between those workers and the people trying to damage them. And that difference is currently visible in the contrast between what is happening in Ottawa and what is happening in Washington. The formal timeline of this investigation runs approximately 150 days before a preliminary determination is required under the relevant statutory framework. That puts an official finding somewhere in early autumn. But the damage being inflicted is not waiting for official findings. It is accumulating daily in delayed orders and deferred investment decisions and supply chain adjustments that companies are making right now to reduce their exposure to political risk. Every morning that Canadian exporters wake up under this cloud of investigation is another morning that American buyers have a reason to hesitate. Another morning that procurement managers are quietly exploring alternative sourcing arrangements. Another morning that the integrated economic relationship that has generated prosperity on both sides of the border for generations erodes a little further. Even if the investigation ultimately produces what the only honest conclusion would require it to produce, which is a finding of no credible evidence, the undoing of that damage is not automatic or guaranteed. Companies that restructure their supply chains away from Canadian inputs do not instantly reverse those decisions when a political probe concludes without findings. Trust that has been damaged by bad faith action does not repair itself on a schedule convenient to the party that broke it. This is precisely why the push for resolution through the formal dispute mechanism matters so much. A neutral panel examining the available evidence, operating under the rules that both countries agreed to and that one of them is now treating as optional, would be required to look at what actually exists rather than what is politically convenient to assert. It would force Washington to either present something that qualifies as credible evidence or formally back down in a venue where the outcome is binding and public. That accountability is exactly what the current administration has demonstrated consistent unwillingness to accept from any international body or arbitration process that might constrain its freedom of action. The question of whether it will engage with that process honestly is not really a question at this point. The pattern of behavior is established. The more relevant question is what happens to the agreement itself and to the broader architecture of North American economic cooperation. If the United States simply refuses to participate in the dispute resolution system it helped design and once publicly celebrated. Zoom out far enough, and what becomes visible is something that extends well beyond trade policy. The relationship between these two countries has been built over generations on a foundation of genuine partnership, not merely transactional convenience. When American airspace closed in the immediate aftermath of the September 2001 attacks, Canada did not issue a diplomatic statement of support and return to normal operations. Canadian airports absorbed hundreds of diverted flights. Canadian families opened their homes to thousands of stranded Americans who had nowhere else to go. Canadian soldiers deployed to Afghanistan and did not come home alive. Canadian intelligence services have operated as functional extensions of American security infrastructure across decades of shared threat assessment. That history of partnership is not a leverage point in a negotiation. It is the actual substance of a relationship that has made both countries safer and more prosperous than either would be in its absence. And what is being communicated through this investigation, through the rhetoric that preceded it, through the internal strategy documents describing forced labor accusations as having political resonance is that none of that history provides any insulation when domestic political calculations point in a different direction. The Prime Minister said something in his parliamentary address that has traveled well beyond the chamber where it was delivered. He told his government and his country that Canada will not be made small so that others can feel large. That line resonates because it names something true about the dynamic at work. The entire operational logic of this kind of pressure requires the target to absorb the diminishment, to accept the framing, to respond with the cautious deference of a smaller country that cannot afford open confrontation with its most powerful neighbor. Canada is declining that role, not through military posture, where the asymmetry is simply too vast to matter, not through economic scale, where a population 1/10 the size cannot generate equivalent leverage through market power alone, but through the consistent application of moral clarity and the willingness to absorb short-term political cost in defense of a principle that actually matters, which is that rules-based systems only survive if the powerful countries inside them choose to be constrained by the same rules they expect smaller partners to follow. The world watching this unfold is drawing conclusions that will shape relationships and alignments well beyond this specific dispute. Countries that have historically accepted American partnership as a stable foundation for their own economic and security planning are recalibrating their assessments. Adversaries are studying the fractures. The question that outlasts this particular investigation, that persists regardless of how the formal process resolves, is whether the international order that emerged from the catastrophe of the 20th century's worst conflicts, imperfect and unevenly applied as it has always been, can survive the sustained pressure of powerful nations deciding that rules are for other people. Canada has answered that question for itself. The answer coming from Washington will define what kind of world the next generation inherits.